Today's notes are titled End of the Vietnam War. This is Unit 8, Notes number 5. The Tet Offensive turns the war. The year 1968 began with a surprise attack by the Viet Cong on numerous cities in South Vietnam, known as the Tet Offensive. The Viet Cong attacked over 100 cities in South Vietnam, and so this map gives you an idea of kind of where these attacks were, just how widespread. And this all occurred during the Lunar New Year that the Vietnamese people celebrated, known as Tet. And so they kind of took it as there had been a kind of truce to not do anything during that period, but they took advantage of that to make these attacks. The Viet Cong even attacked the U.S. Embassy. The Tet Offensive shook the American public, who had been repeatedly told that the enemy was close to defeat. So seeing the South Vietnamese attack, basically made it confirm that everything they knew was not true. Following the Tet Offensive, Johnson's popularity plummeted. Nearly half of the country now felt it had been a mistake to send American troops to Vietnam. Johnson withdraws. Before the Tet Offensive, the anti-war coalition of the Democratic Party had sought to have Robert Kennedy challenge Johnson in the 1968 primary elections. The Democratic Party became divided. On March 31st, 1968, Johnson announced that the U.S. would seek negotiations to end the war. He also announced that he would not seek nor accept the nomination for president. So now, who would the Democratic Party nominate? It seemed wide open for Robert Kennedy to kind of step in, secure the nomination, and then be able to run for president. So let's stop and think. How does the Tet Offensive change public opinion for the war? Seeing that the South Vietnamese people were still fighting, still up in arms, it definitely changed people's perspective, led them to think that this war was not going to be ending anytime soon, and kind of questioning whether or not we should be there. So it lost a lot of support for the war. Election of 1968. Robert Kennedy gained a lot of support in his campaign for the presidential nomination. Unfortunately, he was killed right after the California primary that he had just won. So he was seen as the front runner, but after his death, Hubert Humphrey would get the Democratic nomination for president. With all the turmoil in the Democratic Party, Republican candidate Richard Nixon was able to win the election of 1968. During the presidential race, Nixon campaigned on a promise to restore law and order, which appealed to many Americans who were tired of the years of riots and protests. He also promised to end the war in Vietnam. President Nixon and Vietnamization. In the summer of 1969, newly elected President Richard Nixon announced the first U.S. troop withdrawals from Vietnam. As negotiations started between North and South Vietnam, it was clear that they were going nowhere. Nixon's plan to end the war was known as Vietnamization. This would call for the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops in order for the South Vietnamese to take on a more active role in the war. Over the next 3 years, the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam dropped from more than 500,000 to less than 25,000. Nixon wanted to try to establish a peace with honor for the U.S. to maintain its dignity since we were technically withdrawn. Nixon demanded that the South Vietnamese government remain intact. America's longest war ends. In March of 1972, the North Vietnamese launched their largest attack on South Vietnam since the Tet Offensive in 1968. President Nixon responded by ordering a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnamese cities. It was after this that the Nixon administration took steps to finally end America's involvement in Vietnam. On January 27, 1973, the United States signed an agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. Under the agreement, North Vietnamese troops would remain in the South and South Vietnam. Nixon promised to respond with full force to any violation of the peace agreement. On March 29, 1973, the last U.S. combat troops left for home. For America, the Vietnam War had ended. War leaves a painful legacy. The Vietnam War exacted a terrible price from its participants. In all, 58,000 Americans were killed and some 303,000 were wounded. North and South Vietnamese deaths topped 2 million. In America, a divided nation attempted to come to grips with an unsuccessful war. The conflict in Vietnam left many Americans with a more cautious outlook on foreign affairs and a more cynical attitude toward their government. Many veterans faced indifference or even hostility from an America still torn and bitter about the war. The war resulted in several major U.S. policy changes. First, the government abolished the draft, which had stirred so much anti war sentiment. The country also took steps to curb the president's war making powers. In November of 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which stipulated that a president must inform Congress within 48 hours of sending forces into a hostile area without a declaration of war. And then here is a picture of the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Let's stop and think. How did the Vietnam War change America? I think in a lot of ways it took away the innocence of America in terms of changing that we always support the country, dividing the country in some ways. And then kind of then leading into the Watergate scandal in which Richard Nixon will eventually resign as president. It does create kind of a jaded sense for the American public. So really kind of just changing people's perception of the president, the federal government, their roles. Should we trust them? Should we believe? And kind of that doubt in people's minds. So definitely just overall changing people's perspectives.